Heavenly King, Comforter, Spirit of Truth, present in all places, filling all things, come and dwell in us, deliver, sustain, save our souls, O gracious Lord.
Amen.
Amen. All right. So before we jump into our discussion on service and on humility, let's take a moment if there are any thoughts, questions, or reflections on our previous talk of thoughts and family from last class.
Only to say how very much we enjoyed that discussion. And I don't know if it was the topic or what, but it really jumped out for me anyway. I just felt that it was things I was interested in. The two chapters that we're doing today, although very good, were a little harder for me to get engaged in. That maybe they're like more abstract or what, but they didn't just jump out at me like last couple weeks ago.
Oh, then I'm excited because today's discussion to me is very, very salient for this world, and there are points that I'm just really looking forward to us deconstructing.
Okay, good. Maybe you can help me get excited about it as well.
All right, so let's go to the first one, which was on humility.
Yeah.
And we're going to do like we did last time, and we're going to go down the line and have each person give their own little reflection on what they enjoyed, something that stuck out to them, and then we'll do a general reflection altogether.
Okay.
So, Steve, you want to kick us off?
Okay, let me see which one I want to do here. Okay, I think, let me just, I don't have page numbers because I'm in a Kindle here.
That's okay.
But this is, I can.
What number is it?
I'll be able to tell you the number in a minute. Okay, this is number 3. And I got some lines in this that I have underlined here. First, how can we forgive when we are not the same as they are? How many times have we offended other fellow men? We must learn to keep our peace. Until you have suffered much in your heart, you cannot learn humility. Around in that same section, when we say stay calm, when someone attacks us from all sides, when we can keep our inner peace in spite of that person's rudeness, then our soul will become meek and humble, and we will live this life with a full understanding of it. And our neighbors will tell us, you have changed. You need to have you used to have a fiery temperament, but now you have somehow become calm and dispassionate. But we have not become dispassionate. Rather, this is how the victory over evil manifests itself.
Yes, that is an extremely powerful section. What stood out to you about it?
Well, the first thing is, we have a tendency to criticize others, but usually, even the things that we criticize others for, we can really probably criticize ourselves for.
Well, the part that in that same number 3, the part that jumped out at me was, unless we humble ourselves, God will not stop humbling us.
My dear friend, I'm not going to give his name, but one of my brother priests, he said to me when he read this book, that was the line that stuck with him the whole way through it. And he said, oh my gosh, Lord, teach me humility so that I'll stop giving you opportunities to humble me.
Humble me, right. That was a little bit scary.
Right.
But really, there's an emphasis here on language. And this is where, Pat, when you're saying that some of this might seem theoretical, and I really want us to really hone in, because while this section is called humility, you'll notice that he constantly says again and again and again throughout this section, meekness and humility, that the two are hand in hand.
Right.
And so I really want us to kind of focus on those two things, because what Steve centered in on is the idea that we are constantly upset when somebody is rude to us. We're just, I can't believe they said that to us. I can't believe that they treated me that way. And we get angry, and this is directly tied to meekness and humility, that if somebody is meek and humble, these things don't happen. And the ending that Elder Thaddeus talks about, the idea that this isn't dispassion, it's victory over passion. There's a difference.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So very, very powerful, very, very powerful, Steve. And I think we're going to focus a lot on that when we circle back. Pat?
Okay, what I picked up on is, I guess basically number 7, the end of 6,
Mm-hmm.
and the end of 5 and 7, is the linking of humility and obedience.
Mm-hmm.
Humility is attained through obedience. He
Yes.
who is not obedient cannot attain humility.
Correct.
So he's talking about obedience to God, right?
Talking about it in multiple fashions. And what's funny to me is one of the most popular avenues in culture today is yoga.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And what does the word yoga mean?
I don't really know.
It means yoke. It's the same concept as a
yoke.
oxen having a yoke around his neck,
Oh.
meaning that you are being pulled or directed into a certain direction. So it is obedience. So the different types of yoga basically mean obedience to a certain direction. So this idea of obedience, training wheels as it were, is not just within Christianity, but is seen throughout different philosophies and theologies. So what does this mean? That humility is achieved through obedience. It basically means that if we're not given direction, we're not going to know where to go. And if we don't know where we're going, how can we have any kind of sense of identity?
Mm-hmm.
This, to me, especially in this era where we are giving, in my opinion, too many choices to children, we are not giving them direction. We're not helping them find identity and humility, because there's basically anything and everything. You can do anything. You can be anything, regardless of what kind of ramifications that might have. So yes, Pat, that is a very interesting point to look at the idea of how do we achieve humility through obedience.
Yeah.
Very, very good.
Well, in that same section number 7, in the next paragraph, physical outward humility is easier to attain than inner humility,
Right.
humility of the mind. So if you think about like this concept of direction that you're talking about, I mean, okay, if we, fall into a river, we're going to follow the direction of the river, whether we like it or not. I mean, depending upon how fast the current is going. And of course, it's pretty easy to get in line with that current. And I guess you could say that there are currents in the social world as well. But when you talk about what direction is your mind going to take, that's obviously a lot harder to find direction, because we are bombarded again from all different directions as to what we should do.
This is a key element, Steve, which is why the idea of pious versus pietistic is really oftentimes only seen in the person's, own self-reflection. Why am I doing what am I doing? If we're actually questioning ourselves that, if it's about, to be appearing pious, if it's about appearing humble, these are very different than actually being humble, to actually have humility in our thoughts. So yes, this is something that can only be done through training, and ascesis is the Greek term, asceticism. So these are very, very powerful things. So we're looking at the idea of suffering leading to humility. We're looking at the idea of obedience leading to humility. So let's go ahead and move over to the next window, to Doctors Marina and Ed, and get their reflections.
I was also struck, just like Pat, by number 7, and that opening line where humility is a divine property and the perfection of the Christian life. And I guess it's maybe what I've been reading myself as well, but this idea of humility and being a divine property and being the perfection of the Christian life, it's kind of if it's the perfection of the Christian life, it's kind of the aim of our entire existence.
Mm-hmm.
And when we see humility, we can see that ultimate humility displayed in Christ, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the idea of humility being our means to communing with Christ, and that's the fulfillment of our nature. And this idea that obedience is the training wheels to that. I have heard it expressed by another theologian that, this idea of obedience, it goes against what our common perception of freedom is that freedom of choice is actually what the modern man thinks of as freedom. He has the ability to choose whatever he wants, where in actuality, it's more akin to learning a musical instrument and learning, what it actually means to play that instrument. And so once you have the framework and you understand what music is and how you can play it, you have the freedom, once you have those boundaries, to sort of express yourself within it in the way you would want to. Whereas if I went up to a piano, I would just start banging around the keys. I wouldn't be able to do anything that I actually wanted to do with the instrument. But true freedom is obtained through obedience and learning humility. So I kind of made all those connections and probably just expressed it pretty poorly just now. But
No, Doctor, I was about to say is I think you should actually teach a music class, because I don't think I've ever heard anybody discuss jazz music the way you just did. Well, because think about it, jazz music at its heart is, it seems wild, it seems like it's free, it's going everywhere, but it's not. It is following specific rules. It is in between the rhythm, between the scales. I mean, it seems like it's random, but it's not. It's exactly as you said, Doctor, is that you discover the framework, and then once you have that framework, then it gives you the freedom to be able to go to different places to express yourself in a more full way. So no, that was very artfully expressed, Doctor, and I thank you for it.
You could really
good analogy, Ed.
You could really expand that to any discipline.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, take physics, right? I mean, if Einstein hadn't studied Newton, he couldn't have had the freedom to express himself and look at the world in a different way.
To depart from some of that.
To depart from it and come up with relativity.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Marina?
I'm trying to think what I was going to bring up now. I can't remember because I thought that was a really good point. So now I'm chewing on it. I think to Pat's point and to Ed's point, that line about our humility is in proportion to our obedience, and then the lines that followed, I just personally found them very convicting. And
this is in point 7.
Yeah, just about and I think Steve was talking about it as well, about the outward versus the inward, and just how much easier it is. He makes the point that, you can cure someone with outward pride pretty easily.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Pride, that's very difficult. And, and then I was just thinking about how much of my time or energy or thoughts are actually spent just trying to cover up things so that, it's not obvious what kind of pride or things I have, and how self-destructive that is. It's almost like we'd be better off to just be open about our about our sins, and we could be more easily remediated. But anyway.
Well, what you bring upon, Doctor, is actually, we see this within the writings of the Church Fathers constantly. We look at these individuals, we think to ourselves, these are the masters. These people have mastered the art of humility. And we see that in the next section, where we're talking about how the Church Fathers, actually, no, it's this section, that the Church Fathers, they mastered this art. And yet, if you read their writings, it's like they're constantly belittling themselves to say, I don't have that humility in my heart. I don't have it in my mind yet. And so this idea of the inward humility, constantly fighting against it, because yes, it's easy to take away the things like, okay, just don't speak. There's an adage that says that a fool is revealed when he opens his mouth. You know, as
Right.
long as we're not talking, then people just say,
right.
why is this person's, this person's humble, but what's going on up here?
Well, is it in the next chapter where he gives the story about a Chinese man who's at a
Yes.
meeting and everyone's giving their opinion on everything and he says
He's
not
just
a
praying.
word? Right.
Mhm.
Yeah, it makes me think of the idea of considering ourselves first among sinners. And,
Mhm.
it's a nice concept. And I'm always like, well, that, I can't be that bad, right? And I can't remember if it was in here or where, but they brought up the point that, yeah, you can, we all compare ourselves to other people. And because we're not humble like the saints or the fathers, we always think, oh, well, I can't be as bad as that guy. But that actually the saints don't compare themselves to their fellow man, but to God. And that's where
Yeah.
humility comes
Yeah.
from. Because it's like we're all within a certain standard deviation of of bad human behavior, but us compared to God is where the true comparison is, and that's what when I really want to humble myself, that's what I should be pushing for, is to fathom that difference, not the difference.
You're right, Marina. That's a humbling comparison.
Yeah. On the other hand, and I think I read this in the Lenten season book by Hopko, and one of the things where he was talking about the first being the first. Why do we say the first among sinners? And it's really because when we're talking to God, we're only ourselves. Who else is there? So we're of course we're the first.
Mm-hmm. It's very, very important that I apologize, we're not going over to the Tobiases. They're having a dinner party right now, so they're just listening in. But it's very, very important that we look at these terms of humility and meekness, because humility should not be construed with just lowliness. The idea of just somehow I'm low. When we compare ourselves to God, yes, of course we're low, but being humbled doesn't mean being beaten down into something. It means understanding, and oftentimes that only comes about through struggle, through pain, through obedience. But ultimately, what is it trying to do? It's trying to get us to where Dr. Ed was talking about, to understand the rules, the framework. And what it's really talking about is identity. Humility is self-awareness, knowing exactly who and what you are in every conceivable way. If you know who and what you are, then you know where you can grow and you know where you need to cut back. If you are humble, you know what you are. And this is why it's the divine attribute, because it's actually knowing yourself. It's the ability to have actualization, because you know what you are, you know who you are. And that's why it's the divine principle. That's why it's the highest of all of them. Because how many of us really know ourselves? So many times in our own thoughts, we're like, well, am I doing this right? Am I doing this? Am I sinning? Am I this? Am I this? Because we're not aware. Now let's complicate it. Because again, he keeps talking about the word meek, meek and humble, meek and humble. And he talks about how children, in point number 8, how children are meek. No, and when he's talking about children, he means little children. He doesn't mean, older children.
Yeah.
He means little children. So what does meek mean? What does it mean to be meek?
Well, at our last session, I remember asking you that, or you asked all of us, and a lot of us felt that maybe it was equivalent to being sort of timid, but you quickly explained that it's not timidity, that it's kind of being not touched by criticism, not touched by praise, just kind of being peaceful within yourself in a way.
Mm-hmm. So basically, and this was made manifest in another story. Have you all heard the story about the monk who was dealing with this issue?
I don't know.
Did I mention that in last class?
I'm not sure.
So this monk was getting praised by his brother monks, and everyone was saying he's got the best voice, he chants so wonderfully, his theology is great, he's handsome, he's going to be the next abbot for sure. And so this monk was trying to wrestle with himself, to stay humble, but his spiritual father saw in him that he was failing. He was starting to like take it to heart, like, oh man, maybe I am so good. And so he told him, I want you to meet me at the cemetery. Now, in monasteries in Greece, and in fact most Orthodox countries, they're a little different. Basically what they are is, they're called Skepolophylakion, and if we look at like the room behind me as what that room is, it would basically be shelves behind me of skulls.
Right. Ossuaries.
I'm sorry?
Ossuaries. Yeah.
Yes. And then in the corner, you'd have all the other bones just kind of tossed over there.
In a pile. Yeah.
Right. So basically, once the body had decayed enough that it could be skeletalized and cleaned, they would put the skulls on a line, label them, and then they would just put all the other bones off to the side. And this was the place where the monks would eventually go, and you would treat that area with great respect. So the abbot, or excuse me, not the abbot, his spiritual father told him, my child, I want you to, while you spend the night in this room, because you're going to spend the night in this room, I want you to curse all of your brothers here. Tell them how bad they were. And so out of obedience, he spent the whole night screaming, you wicked monks, you sinful monks. He threw a rock at one of them, cracked the skull. You wicked, wicked people. So he spent the whole night yelling and screaming at them, just absolutely berating them in his anger. The next morning, his spiritual father opens the door and says, all right, go about your daily duties and then come back here tonight. So he does, and he comes back and he says, okay, tonight, you're going to tell all of your brothers how wonderful they are. And so out of obedience, he does. He spends the whole night singing psalms about how he's unworthy to be in the presence of such saints. He takes plaster and fixes the crack on the skull that he had hurt. So he spends the whole night weeping and crying for all of these monks. The next morning, his spiritual father opens the door and sees that his spiritual child is obviously very tired after 2 straight days of being in there, and asks him, so what did you learn? The spiritual child looks at him, what do you mean, what did I learn? It's okay, so when you cursed your brothers, how did they respond? The spiritual child looked at him funny. He's like, what do you mean, how did they respond? They're dead. They didn't respond. And when you praised them, how did they respond? How did they react to your praises? They're dead. They didn't react at all. They didn't say anything. You need to be like them. So the idea is that just like the dead that are neither moved by curses or praises, that's what it means to be meek. It's to be absolutely unmovable. So if you are meek, you cannot be moved. If you are humble, you know who you are. If you've achieved these 2 attributes, then you have approached what it means to be like God. That means that the world doesn't bother you. If you've achieved meekness and humility, then what does it matter if somebody insults you? It doesn't matter. And if you're humble and you know who you are and what you are in the relation of God and his creation, then you have love for all of your brothers and sisters. And so you can't be angry at them. So it's a beautiful thing when we can achieve this greatest of virtues. That's why I say that I almost think that he should have labeled us meekness and humility, because they go hand in hand. And that's why he pairs the 2 so often in this chapter. So let's go ahead and move on to the next chapter on serving God and neighbor. So why don't we go the opposite direction this time, and we'll start with Dr. Marina.
Here it goes.
Sorry, I read this a little bit ago, so I'm just refreshing my memory. Yeah, I remember this part. Now that I'm looking at it again. So I think this.
Which number is it?
Let's see, it'd probably be 6. and 7, where he's talking about sort of the balance of how to take in other people's concerns and to basically help your fellow man deal with their troubles. And, you know, just the way in which we cope or don't cope with them based on, you know, whether, again, our own minds and intentions are right. And I thought that was, you know, working in a profession that's very worried about burnout. I thought this was particularly salient. But then again, I was remembering his own life story, and it also seems like maybe these came out of some times where he wasn't following this advice either. Because he seemed to have suffered a lot, both because of his own health problems, but because of the amount of, like, you know, just pilgrims and things like that he was seeing and taking on. So yeah, it really spoke to me in my own, you know, dealing with people and sort of the therapeutic professions.
Absolutely. And
well, and in point 7, Marina, he sort of gives us the answer to that. If you have a burden that gets beyond what you can bear, you should turn it over to God. When you bring all your cares and troubles to him, as well as the cares and troubles of your fellow man, he takes the burden from us and we feel lighter.
Which kind of gets
so
back
that
to
we shouldn't try to deal with this on our own.
Exactly. Yeah. Which kind of gets back to the humility idea that you're really not helping your fellow man. You're merely being a vessel for God's goodness and mercy.
I guess what I related to too with Elder Thaddeus is that, like so many of us, particularly myself, he was really prone to anxiety and depression. All of his life, it seems like he battled that.
Absolutely. And this is, you know, it's the very human nature that we have and our compassion in us, that we want to help other people, but A, we don't know how to do it appropriately, and then B, we don't know how to do it without overwhelming ourselves. So
I mean, I feel overwhelmed sometimes, you know, with the letters from inmates when they tell me, you know, what they're going through, what they have been through. And the worst is when they ask for my advice, because I don't know what to tell them, you know. So yeah, I need help.
They're very, very powerful, and we're going to circle back to this because there's an overarching theme here that we're going to really address as we close out this section. But Dr. Marina, what a wonderful way to break us into it.
Yeah.
Dr. Ed?
I was, I think it was actually the last point, and there's a point on where he speaks about, I often find that I want to defend justice, but always seem to end up having injustice done to me. We can defend justice, but will justice be done? And I just think about how our own sense of justice is often a pale sort of reflection of what God's justice actually is. How, you know, people speak of the cross as God's justice and mercy meet. I think that's more of a struggle within Protestant theology sometimes, the way they deal with what was achieved on the cross. But I also think, you know, we speak of God's justice, but I've seen Orthodox theologians say that it was just when he created the world, because he created it and put everything in their proper proportion. And so man's justice is an attempt to recompense people for what they have done in proportion in the way that they've done it. And so there's no way, and I think about this especially in terms of grave injustices like murders and wars, there's no way that we can put things right after that. There's no way that we can raise the dead on our own and just restore things the way that they should be, the way that God's justice originally intended it. And so I struggle with the sense of, you know, what are we supposed to say about justice, and how, you know, I heard one I think I read one monk saying that we should never pray that God is just toward us, that we only experience God, and that we have no sense of God's justice to us personally. And so I thought of, what he was saying in that last point in those terms.
It's a very powerful element. And again, Doc, you've hit on something that's very, very important for us to understand, which is the difference between justice and righteousness. Because what we see as justice in our worldly sense does not compare to the righteousness of God. It just can't. We don't understand it. One of the elements that was earlier talking about was in war. The idea of, okay, well, war is not just. So how do you defend it? And well, that soldier did a good job of saying, well, you want to destroy our freedoms to be able to worship. So yes, this is evil, but we cannot allow ourselves to be slaves in that regard. So it's this very delicate balancing act. The other element too, which is that we sometimes think to ourselves, especially in life, that, oh, well, this isn't fair. Why is this happening? They work so hard. Why are they getting downtrodden and they're not working hard? Without recognizing that, of course, God does have a plan. God is just, and in the end, there will be recompense. That all of these things will come to pass. What you seem to think that is unfair now, there will be fairness when everything is all said and done. But yeah, that's a very hard thing to read, to say. I was like, okay, so aren't we supposed to strive for justice? Well, to an extent, but I think his point is that we lose ourselves sometimes too much in it and lose sight of where we're actually trying to get, because we get so bogged down in it that we realize we're not actually accomplishing anything, which is sometimes hard to actually take in.
Well, myself, I pray that God be merciful with me rather than just with me.
If he was just with us, we would be struck down.
We would be in trouble, right?
Correct.
So we pray that he be merciful to us rather than just. Of course he's just, but you know what I'm trying to say, Father.
Right. Well, here's the thing. Like, for example, King David, in his Psalm 50, we're all familiar with Psalm 50?
Oh, yes.
In it, he says, deliver me from blood guiltiness, O Lord. Because according to the law, which is God's own law in that regard, what was David's just reward for what he did?
Yeah.
Death. He should have been put to death for what he did.
Right.
And he's asking God, don't let this happen. Forgive me. Don't allow this to happen. And this is something too that people don't seem to understand when they say, oh, God is forgiving. Yes, he is forgiving and merciful. By the very virtue of the fact that, if we're being realistic, because of my affront to God, because of what I've done to God, if he was being just, he would obliterate me from existence.
Strike me dead.
Exactly, because I blaspheme him constantly by my very actions. But because he's loving, because he is kind, because he does not deal with me justly, but with compassion and mercy, he allows me the time to repent. He allows me the opportunity to say, Lord, forgive me for what I've done. So that's very, very powerful.
But okay, but go back to this. We know we're not at God's level of justice and understanding, even his level of what his justice is or his righteousness is. But we are confronted with injustice in the world, and Christ himself was, confronted injustice in the world when he went into the temple and overturned, the money changers' tables.
Yes.
Which seems to me an example. Of course, we are not the same vessel to, in terms of, choosing the right action that, as he must have at that time. But we have to decide, what do we do when we confront, injustice, or when we see it.
I don't think that he's taking a passive stance here of saying, oh, we need to just be passive and say, well, whatever it is because God so willed. I don't think he's intimating that, because that would contradict his former points earlier. I think what he's trying to get at here is the efficacy of our actions. Is it actually doing what we want it to do, as opposed to just stressing out over something where ultimately And this is definitely a case by case basis. Like, is what I'm doing effectual? Is it actually bearing fruit? Or am I basically arrogantly trying to strive for something despite the fact that it is actually not doing anything, but causing more harm than good? And that's a case by case basis. I don't think that he is advocating for us to not step forward for what is just, and to not try to step out and take care of the unrighteousness and the injustices that there are. Our own saint, Saint Basil the Great, did not, fear talking down to an emperor and telling him, you know what, you are being unjust in the way that you are behaving. The way that you've gone to war is horrific, and you are going to be held accountable for this. And the emperor said, "It was like, how can you? I've never met a bishop talk to me like this." And Saint Basil said, "Well, then you've never met a Christian bishop." So we are called to be active. We are called to take part in justice and to mete out the injustices of the world in a Christian manner. So I think it's very difficult when we read that and say, okay, well, what is he getting at? I think we have to take it as the whole of his writings to say, okay, I think he's talking about case by case basis. If that makes sense.
I think he speaks to this point in it's point number 2. It ends with righteousness acts never in its own interest, but in the interest of fellow men.
Mm-hmm.
And I've heard it explained when Christ went into the temple and threw out all the money changers and overthrew the tables. He wasn't, because we see him being very meek and humble and accepting the insults that people throw at him. But when he was in his Father's house, that's when his indignation was sort of aroused. I've heard it explained in those terms. It was like, it wasn't necessarily directed at his own person. He accepted those insults. But when people are insulting God, and they're insulting God through injustice to our neighbor, that's when we're asked to take action.
And I do feel that we do have an obligation to speak out against injustice, not injustice against us, but injustice that we see in the world toward other groups of people, toward, racial injustice or whatever. I do feel an obligation to speak out against that.
Absolutely. To shine the light on it,
Yes.
To bring truth. But we also have to understand too, because I think sometimes we get confused about the section where Jesus Christ is, tossing out the money chambers, because immediately they ask him, under what authority do you do this? And Jesus Christ responded to them. He didn't actually answer them. He said, tear down this temple, in 3 days I will build it up again. And of course, was he talking about the physical temple? No, he was talking about his body.
Right.
So ultimately, he's talking not about the physicality there. He's talking about what was going on in the temple, the hypocrisy and the desecration of the temple, which isn't necessarily about the physical building. After all, in just 2 chapters of the Gospel of John, when he's talking to Photini at the well, he tells her, look, it's not going to be in Jerusalem or on the mountain where people are worshiping God in truth, but in the Spirit, which means that Jesus Christ, is more concerned with the idea of the actual temple, which is us. To basically root out hypocrisy, root out iniquity within ourselves so that we can receive the Holy Spirit. And that he does with anger, with zeal. Zeal for your house has consumed me. And is it just talking about the physical house? No, because in 70 AD, that whole house is going to get wiped out.
Yeah.
So, no, we're looking at the weightier matters of the human being, the human person. Pat and Steve, did you have particular verses?
I had
No, he's asking me.
no.
It's just who'd you ask?
I asked you first, but either one of you
go
will
first.
give-
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was looking at point number 3, and the question of work. And it's interesting. He starts out. He says that any work we do here on earth is God's work. However, we always work with reservation. And okay, so I'm thinking about how, and I think this, I don't know if this came up within our study group or whether it was maybe in one of your sermons, but it seemed to have come up recently, about, okay, well, and I remember back when I was working, now I'm retired, that, I really, put a lot of energy into that work. And it wasn't just, because I had a job and I had the money, but I wanted to, you know, you know, do good work, and I wanted to solve problems. And we had goals when, for our department per se, and we needed to, get those things done. So I worked hard. Well, here, I don't feel like I'm working as hard as I could, like with the prison ministry and writing letters and other things. I mean, am I working as hard as I did then? Probably not. And yet it's even more clearly that what I'm doing now is God's work, even though that other work, according to this Elder Thaddeus, was also God's work.
Mm-hmm. There's basically what's getting at is the idea of authenticity in your work, that you don't look at any job that you're doing as beneath you or not worth it, to not have hatred towards your bosses, but to look, what I'm doing right now is important, and I'm going to treat it as important no matter what it is. And this gets to the idea of callings. Everybody has a calling. I remember reading an article that was really, really good. This woman in it was talking about her particular ministry, and she said, I have a calling, two callings actually. My first calling was to be a mother, because everyone that is a mom, it's a calling. It's not just a happenstance thing. You were called to do it, and you answer that call. But the second call she said she had was to be a hairdresser. And when she was, doing people's hair, she saw the ministry that she was doing was basically listening to people. Because as she's cutting hair, people are telling their life stories. So in a way, she became a therapist, and she used this as an opportunity to spread love and Christ to people. So she saw that as her calling. If each of us take what we're doing and we see it as a calling, as our opportunity to do it well, to do it for our fellow man, and to bring each other closer to Christ, then suddenly it has deeper meaning. It has more agency for our salvation. And so by working diligently, no matter what that is, there's something powerful about it. Now, my favorite section, excuse me, we'll get to me later. So let's get to Pat then.
Okay. Again, I'm going back to this. I'm in number 14 now. And it's to Ed's point, this question of justice and injustice. And he says, and I'm trying to understand, he says, it's always best to keep silent at large gatherings. Let others bring out their suggestions. We should keep silent. Mind your own business and try to keep your peace. We will not prevent injustice by our words. With words, we can only offend someone and hurt the other person even more. The best we can do is to turn to the one who alone gives justice, meaning God.
Mm-hmm.
He says, even if we say something trying to defend someone from injustice, we're not doing that person a favor. So again, I'm trying to understand, Father. Is he saying that we shouldn't say anything? That
what he is saying, and this gets back to Dr. Marina's point, is that when we don't have peace, we're not helping. We're causing harm. The reality is that we see someone drowning, we see an injustice, we want to help that person. And so we dive into the water. We're going to do it, we're going to do it, we're going to do it. And yet, even if we're an expert swimmer, if you get out to somebody that's kicking and drowning in the water, what's going to happen to you?
you'll be pulled down.
You'll be pulled down. You'll both die. So ultimately, what do you need to do? What do lifeguards do when someone's drowning?
They get a life raft or something.
Get a buoy, they get a life raft, they get something and bring it to that person, and that is able to bring them back. So ultimately, what he's talking about is that in order for us to actually cause good, In order for us to actually affect change, we need to bring people to Christ. And what does that mean? Does it mean to physically drag them to Christ? Maybe, to some extent. But what he's really talking about is our own spirituality, that we ourselves need to find that peace, to bring Christ into that room, into that setting, into that scenario. Because what oftentimes happens is, whether it's for ourselves or for another person, we lose sight of the fact that we're trying to do good and instead try to only accomplish our own justice. And by our own justice, I mean, I hate to say it this way, but scoring a point. Well, I'm right.
I see. Yeah.
As opposed to actually accomplishing what you set out to do. This happened to me once when I was in a group setting where there was 4 or 5 priests, and we were all, interacting with the group. And a priest asked me, said, "Father, why are you speaking? Is it because you have something to say, or because you want to be heard?"
No.
And so this is the element of why he's saying, keep silent, be prayerful. Because ultimately, if we're just seeking to score a point or to try to think that I'm gonna make the point, we're gonna cause harm. We're gonna mess up. Whereas if we are prayerful, if we have Christ in our heart, then the word that needs to be spoken will be given to you, and you'll be able to effectively do what you actually set out to do, bringing it to Christ and allowing him to help you do what you need to do. So there's 2 elements to this. One, he's basically saying actions speak louder than words. He's saying, you're not going to solve the problem just by talking about it. You need to actually do it. But the other element is that what words you do use will be misused and be misrepresented if they're not done in the proper prayerful way. Does that make sense?
Yes. Okay. Yes. We need to keep that in mind.
The other element that I think that is very, very important in this section, which I think is critical, especially for all of us in various sections, is point number 5, in which he encountered a young woman who was having a terrible time at work. She saw that everyone was hypocritical, everyone was angry, everyone was just and she couldn't stand it. She said, I can't bear this. And so when he told her to pray for them and told her to basically love them, to be that source of peace, to find her peace in Christ, turn to Christ. And then what happened after 2 years? Suddenly
She loved her
she loved her coworkers.
Yeah.
And then she had a particular coworker that was bothering her.
I remember that. Yeah.
She said, well, Jesus Christ told me to love your enemies. Well, darn it, I'm going to love my enemy.
Yeah.
And then what did it say? Now she's my best friend. And he says, if only every place, every family had one person like that. That if you can be that one person in your family, in your place of business, in your church, that one person that is the source of peace. And by being source of peace, that means that you're not the one actually being peace. You're just a conduit bringing Christ to those people. That if you could be that person, then suddenly everyone around you is affected. Everyone around you is acquiring peace. Everyone around you is stopping their angry habits because the Holy Spirit is now flowing out of you. If every place had just one person like that, it would change everything. And that to me is kind of the basis of where he's going with on how we serve our fellow man. That no matter where we are, no matter what we're doing, no matter what our job is, whether it's doctor, whether it's social worker, whether it's teacher, whether it's counselor, if you do it authentically, if you do it with conviction, and you do it with peace, not only will your work flourish, but it will affect everyone around you. And Christ himself will touch all of their lives. No matter what your job is, it doesn't matter what the job is, whether it's garbage collector or lawyer or anything, it doesn't matter. Everyone will be affected by that. And that is the most powerful way that we serve our brothers and sisters, even more than just giving them food, by bringing them peace. And by doing that, that allows us to do even more physical good works, to actually help people in a real and authentic way. And that's a powerful thing to me. So with our last 10 minutes, let's go round robin and see if anyone has any final thoughts, concerns, or reflections on what we've read today, what we read last time, or just in general.
Well, I'll just say that this section here, and in particular, what you were just talking about, and the sections about work and justice, and it just makes me reflect back on, things in that I've experienced and done in my life, and that where I could have done things differently, and uh, and really solve problems that I was only shooting air at.
Well, I think that goes a little bit to what Pat was saying when she was saying that when she encounters during the prison letter writing, and she says, they're asking for advice. Ultimately, one of the things that we have to try to tell ourselves to is get out of the way, and give it to Christ and say, Christ, inspire me and inspire what I need to write for this person. Don't let me and my arrogance get in the way of your salvific mission for this person. You brought the two of us together. You are the one who is going to supply this paper with what this person needs. Allow my hand to do it. And so when we look at every task that we do in that way, and we ask God to bless it, asking God to bless our patients, asking God to bless our clients, asking God to bless our research, asking God to bless our work in every way possible, that is when we're able to be more effective. Now we can't, and we need to be very careful, because the devil has a way of making us look back in our lives and go, oh man, look at all those wasted opportunities. Look at how I squandered this, or this. No. We look to what we can do now. And we look in joy to see the things that we have done and say, wow, when I was authentic in this, and I saw what happened with that individual, and I saw how that person flourished, and it wasn't me, but God working through the work that I did. And all of you that are before me, I've seen it personally in the way that you've interacted with people and how that has affected other people around you, whether you know it or not. It's a beautiful thing to behold.
Yeah, I guess I'm thinking about this first line of number 3, any work we do here on earth is God's work. And thinking about, if I actually believed that, how would I spend my day differently? How would I walk out of the house on the way to work? So there's that. And then I'm also thinking about, we've talked a little bit about sort of what modern man thinks of as freedom versus not. And one of the things, you hear people kind of quip that oh, if you love what you do, you'll never work a day in your life, that kind of thing. And it makes you think that there's a perfect thing out there for you to do, and you just need to find your quote unquote passion, right? That's a common word now that's used very differently in the way we
follow your passion.
Right. Follow your passion. If you love what you do, you'll never work a day in your life, all these kinds of things. And, it kind of all ties back to the obedience, right? That if we actually are obedient to what God is, the work that God has given us, whatever that is, even if it seems tedious or overwhelming or whatever, that it's right in front of us, that there's no, that searching for some new passion or it's just finding a new instrument you don't know how to play, probably. To go back to Ed's analogy. So, so I think there's a lot of, I don't know, I think I'm going to be chewing on this for a while, just all these connections that are in these 2 chapters.
Absolutely. And that what you're talking about, Doctor, is very key, is the idea of trying to divorce ourselves from the sentimentality of what we are doing, to understand that emotions, first of all, they can be manipulated. Pharmacologically and spiritually, we can be manipulated to feel certain ways. So if we're going by just, well, I'm passionate about it, so therefore I love it, so I'm not working, it's no, there are days where what I'm doing feels tedious. It's still a calling, and that's where I think if you're doing something that is a calling, that you are do well, that God has given you a talent to do something, even if it feels tedious, the idea is that that probably is an indication that You're doing something that's important. And so therefore, the enemy is trying to say, well, don't do it, don't do it. Well, that's because it's bearing fruit. You're doing what is good. And to leave your house, like you said, doctor, if you left your house every day, say, you know what, God has called me to this great work, and I'm going to fulfill that work as to the best of my ability. Changes the dynamic. No longer are you in a profession. No longer are you just going to a job. You're going to your calling. You're going to what you have been called to do by the Lord, to help people in whatever capacity that is, and to do it as well as you are physically able to do. Changes the dynamic on everything.
Right.
Any other thoughts, anyone?
No.
Did this bring it kind of, because Pat, you said at the beginning that this was kind of esoteric and you weren't able to kind of.
Definitely did. Definitely did. I
You
feel
feel like
much better.
you feel like we've kind of zeroed in on it now?
Yeah, you've concretized it for me. Thank you.
Good.
Just going back to that last point you made about, tedium, I mean, I can remember jobs that I had that were tedious, back when I was younger and doing manual work especially. And, you sometimes hear this expression about paying your dues, and in anything that you're doing, I mean, you have to pay your dues first before you can kind of say anything about, maybe even make a suggestion about how something could be done differently. And I'm not, I don't want to belabor the point too much, but yeah, you have to you have to take the tedium and apply yourself to that as much as to something that is, in fact, a little bit maybe more exciting and more challenging mentally, or or creativity, that requires something other than your body. But you have to apply you have to apply even to the tedious.
All of the most successful people, no matter what they are, they all basically said the same thing, that no matter what the job was, from mail clerk all the way up to vice president of a company, they applied the same level of conviction and energy and treated each job as the most important job that they could possibly do at that moment.
Well, Thaddeus says every little blade of grass on earth has some kind of mission. So, no task is too small, it's too inconsequential or beneath you.
And it's also important that we understand the yoking of these two chapters together. And I think it was done on purpose, the idea to understand that, because oftentimes what is most vexing for people in their jobs, no matter what it is to see other people that are not working as hard as you promoted faster than you, or given recognition that you're not given,
getting recognition,
or listened to in a way that you are not listened to. And this is why the humility to basically say, calm down, it's okay.
Yeah.
No matter what is happening, love that person and reflect your peace, and it will go forward.
The point that Pat was referring to about the blade of grass, I'm not sure where
It's
that
number 11.
I'm not even sure what is that.
The second chapter.
That follow the section where it says, like the human being is kind of like the most perfect system or something like that.
Yeah, that's after that. Yeah.
Well, ecological systems are like that. That everything has its place. The relationships of the various different species within an ecosystem. Until somebody comes along and wants to develop it and destroys, and in the process sometimes destroys the ecosystem.
It reminds me of a sermon that Father Kalivas once said at seminary, where he talked about how we're all the body of Christ, but what part of the body? And everyone wants to be something like, well, I want to be the eye, or I want to be the mouth, or I want to be the nose, or the ears, or the right hand. How many people say, I want to be the pinky toe?
The what?
The pinky.
The pinky toe.
Pinky toe.
Or how many people say, I want to be the spleen?
Yeah.
Or I want to be the gallbladder? But every part, no matter how quote unquote inconsequential it might seem, is critical. You know, even the pinky toe, you know, is important for balance. You know, it's everything matters.
The blade of grass matters.
Mm-hmm. So when everything matters, it adds again more consequence to our life and how we perceive it and how we're interacting with it and how our thoughts, as we talked about in the very first one, interacts with all of it and has effects on all of it. So all of this is connected. All right, everybody. I pray everyone has a wonderful, wonderful week.
And you too, Father.
I encourage everyone, if you're able to read ahead, just in case, because our next two chapters are a little shorter.
We have monasticism and prayer are the next two, right?
Monasticism, monastics,
and repentance.
and then there's prayer and love.
Mm-hmm.
So should we read 3 chapters?
Read ahead if you can, just in case we finish more quickly.
Okay.
With those, because I don't suspect we're going to be talking too much on monasticism.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Right. Yeah. Right. That was really short, and there wasn't a great deal in there. Okay.
And we're not.
So we'll go through prayer as well.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
I pray everyone has a wonderful night. Heavenly
And
King,
you too,
Comforter,
Father.
Spirit of Truth, present in all places and filling all things, come and dwell in us, cleanse every stain, save our souls, O gracious Lord. Good night.
Okay.